In the 1980s, there was a public service announcement that was created that I watched along with every other kid in the 80s on the 4 channels you could tune into. And it was an awareness program on drugs. And it was brought to us by none other than the First Lady of the United States, Nancy Reagan. And she was on TV, and there was basically a frying pan, and it was a top-down view of the frying pan, and it showed an egg, and then it showed the egg frying. And it just made 2 statements. Your brain, and it showed the egg, and then it showed the frying egg, and it said, your brain on drugs. And I think the point was to raise awareness that drugs had an effect on your life that you probably never thought of. Drugs maybe felt good at the time, but there was something going on in your brain. And I knew a lot of people who did drugs. Some people very, very close to me did drugs, and I was the kid who didn't. I got to admit, used to be very prideful in that, but not anymore. It just wasn't my thing. I was too busy playing sports and hanging out with girls and driving my 1974 Ford Maverick around Tip City, Ohio, which was the Mav was a legendary car. But anyway, drugs weren't my thing. But I do remember the ad. The point of the ad was that drugs were not just an inconsequential novelty. They were something that had a chemical effect on your brain and that could permanently damage your brain. Of course, we've now learned that the brain can heal. It can repair itself dramatically, thank God. I know a lot of people who would not have jobs because of what they did in the 70s, the 60s for sure, definitely in the 80s, 90s, and on. But the point being, it wasn't just inconsequential. It wasn't just a for-the-moment thing. It had a lasting effect that could permanently, potentially damage your life. And the topic that we're dealing with today, man, as we dial into this series of freedom from porn, is the subject, your brain on porn. In the last episode, we looked at this topic of porn being a seductive liar that led you into a place of pleasure and then captured you and had you. And we looked at the addictive cycle psychologically of porn. Today we're taking a look more at the chemical, physiological side of pornography's effect on the brain. I want to welcome you to the Next Stage podcast. My name is Rob Stout. It is my pleasure to be your host of this program. I love it. I hope you do too. I hope that you are sharing, that you're liking, you are clicking the little things that say, hey, send me notifications of the next program. I hope that you are passing this on to other men, old and young, in your world. That this series, like I said when we first started the Freedom from Porn series, this series is the reason that we started this podcast. Not just to mess around with informational, hey, you didn't know this, and wouldn't it be great if you knew more information? No, but to impact your life and to help make a difference in your world and to potentially make an impact on a generation. And so, dads, as you are listening to this, pass this on to your son. Because in the 80s, we had to work for our porn. We had to go get it somewhere. We had to risk our reputations and walk into a store or maybe dig through a dumpster to find something. Or if you had an uncle or somebody had to find a magazine. This generation has an entire porn factory in their pocket on their cell phone. It's like a crack addict. You're trying to be like, man, I wish I could stop doing crack, or I wish I could stop doing meth. But he's got a drug dealer in his pocket giving it to him like that every day. That's how important this is. And so I want to raise the intensity and the awareness. This is not a casual conversation. This is a very real conversation. And I want to welcome you to the Next Stage episode. Oh gosh, what is it? 17. That we are talking about your brain on porn as part of this series called Freedom from Porn. And the idea is to get you free and to allow you to experience something that is better than where you're at. And as we take a look at your life, again, I know that you are men and you want to raise a generation of young men who desire to lean into the best that life has to offer. We call it summiting life's climb. That life is a journey, life is a climb, and you are guys who grind and you want the best out of your life, and yet gosh, there's probably something in there just sabotaging you. There's something in there you might have just bought into as the new norm. You might just be like, well, this is just the way guys do it, and this is just the way I've got to be. Got to confess, I've been there. Man, there's so much more to it than that. And I want to welcome you to this opportunity as we lean into that aspiration of your life. When you really look yourself in the mirror and say, am I living the way that God made me to be, the way that I was designed to be, and yet analyzing that through the lens of what I know is an issue. It's not $100 billion worldwide industry for nothing. It's there because a lot of consumers are into it. And I want to jump into this series, today's topic, called Your Brain on Porn. So the problem that we approach as we take a look at this topic of your brain on porn is, number one, I want to look at the problem of what happens in the brain. And number two, I want to take a look at the problem of lack of responsibility for taking control and taking responsibility for our lives. Those two problems of not really understanding maybe what is going on. Like Pinocchio, who we talked about in the beginning of this series. He was a little wooden boy, and he wanted to be a real boy. And so he hooked up with these buddies, and they took him to this place called Pleasure Island. And it was all great, and they were playing cards and having fun, and nobody had to follow any rules. And Pinocchio's smoking cigars and turning green. And all of a sudden, the tables got turned, and it was time to pay the piper. And he ended up in a cage. They turned into jackasses, and they were shipped off, and he found himself trapped. I wonder how many of us are trapped in this thing that we just kind of messed around with. So the number one problem I want to take a look at is, what is the problem going on in our brain? And number two, how do we take responsibility for our lives and not just kind of, brush this off as this is someone else's fault, or this is just the way it is, or this is just life in the 21st century and we all are addicted to porn. It's just kind of the way it is. No, man. Let's get real about it. Let's deal with it. And to help us get into our topic today, I invite who I'm going to call the Next Stage Podcast medical advisor. It is Cody Holland, soon to be Dr. Cody Holland. Cody is my son-in-law. He is married to daughter number 2, and he has got a lot to contribute to this topic. We've talked about this subject matter quite a bit and what is going on. And I was like, Cody, we need to talk about this. And we've had some great conversations. And so I invited Cody to be part of the show and to just share some knowledge with us and then to dig into this a little bit together. So, Cody, welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell us about your education, number one, and how you got interested in psychiatry in particular. Go ahead.
Yeah. So my name's Cody. I'm a fourth-year medical student at Rocky Vista University. I am going to be graduating here in May, and I will be applying for psychiatry residency programs in a couple months. And so my original interest in psychiatry was rooted in growing up playing sports and being exposed to sports psychology and just seeing that impact that it had on my own performance, and then being interested in human behavior, how the mind works, what it does, both good and bad. And took that in through high school and into college. And then after college, in between medical school, I interned at the Denver Rescue Mission, and I worked in a homeless shelter with 700 plus men. And I saw a lot of these clients, is what we called them, that would just walk in circles and would talk to themselves and didn't have the mental capacity or mental function because of their psychiatric condition to function in society and to find housing and be able to live on their own. Mm-hmm. And so really that just exposed me to and put in a desire to want to pursue psychiatry and to help out people, but also men, to help with mental illness, and something that we don't really talk about too much or desire to talk about. So
yeah, and hats off to that calling. I can do a lot of things. I'll do a lot, but that whole area, quite honestly, it's so unpredictable. huge amounts of compassion when I see people suffering. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's mental illness is like for real, but I don't know what to do with it. So, dude, way to jump in and being at the Denver Rescue Mission, seeing all of those types of things. That's a calling. So, yeah, and you're applying for residency programs this coming year and wanting to do it in this area of psych, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, yeah, we as a family have been on the journey of Cody being in medical school, and he's done all the work, and we watched him do all the work. But what a grind, what a commitment. So you're almost there.
Yeah, almost there.
Or almost at the beginning, I guess, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, hey, let's jump into the science of addiction, okay? Obviously an area of study for you. You know more where you're at right now as a fourth-year medical student than 99% of people on the planet do about this. And so I wanted to just bring you in as a subject matter expert to talk about the science of addiction. How does it work and what's involved in the brain?
Yeah, good question. So to go off of that, I also just came off an addiction psychiatry rotation where a lot of the patients were substance use, as well as alcohol use. There is still some debate as if porn is part of an addiction medical aspect, but I think anybody that's been exposed to it or has knowledge of it or knows people struggling with it would say that it's definitely addictive, and more research is coming out saying that. So with that in mind,
yeah, and to that point, we're not arguing, hey, this is the absolute steadfast, Cody's done a postdoctoral study on this, and nor do I claim to be an expert here. I've just got a feeling, and I think a lot more research is being done in this area to go, there is a connection. There's no doubt, right? So that said, that disclaimer aside,
yep.
What's going on in the brain? What are the foundational building blocks of this addictive tendency towards porn?
Yeah. So, broad view, what is addiction? The American Society of Addiction Medicine says that addiction is a treatable chronic medical condition involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. So from that definition itself, you can see that there are so many factors that come into play with addiction, not just what's happening in your brain, but what's happening outside in your environment, certain relationship aspects, and it leads to this behavior that is compulsive and oftentimes people feel like they have no control over. That does have harmful consequences and outcomes.
Yeah. And it's that compulsive behavior side of things, like even the acronym of setting yourself up, understanding the circumstances around it. One I've worked with in the past is stressed, tired, alone, bored, STAB. When I'm stressed, I'm tired, I'm alone, or I'm bored. It kind of sets the stage for compulsive behavior. But what's going on in the brain? Are they chemicals? Is it a chemical? Yeah, in the brain. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the three main ones that we're going to touch on, three main neurotransmitters. The first one would be serotonin. So serotonin helps with mood. It helps you feel good. Also helps with certain things like your digestive system and sleep. But usually when you think about people with depression or anxiety, the main goal medically is try to increase serotonin and to help those neurotransmitters increase, and hopefully, usually that helps with depression and anxiety. The second one would be dopamine. Dopamine is a big one that we'll talk about today, where it's the reward system of the brain. When you have a large increase, it tells the body, hey, this feels good. Hey, I want to do this again and again and again. I want more and more and more of it. That's where scientists believe that addiction primarily comes from a neurotransmitter aspect, is that dopamine release pathway. And along with that, you also have norepinephrine, which we think of fight or flight, something that it helps with arousal, it helps with alertness. It could be good or bad. So it could be positive experiences, release norepinephrine, and You also have negative and traumatic events that lead to a fight or flight response and release norepinephrine. And norepinephrine also helps you remember these feelings and helps solidify memories.
Okay.
So those are the three main ones kind of going on when we watch porn and that deal with addiction.
Okay. So serotonin puts you in the mood pathway. Fair enough? Okay. Dopamine is the thing that gets you hooked or creates the hook, reinforces the behavior. And then the interesting thing, the norepinephrine, I think any man who has watched porn and from any angle, you lean into it. You're like, it heightens the awareness, that fight or flight, made for really good reasons. You're going to fight, you're going to run, but it brings that heightened awareness and then locks that in. So it's like it's a thing that triggers the memory that locks in the memory from the car crash or from the home run you hit when you were a kid and the fifth grade and you still remember it, right? That type of stuff. Is that basically the way those three work?
Yeah. And going back to when you were thinking about your acronym of being bored, being tired, being alone, that norepinephrine also kind of gets rid of your boredom, you don't feel like you're alone anymore. You have something to focus on. So it also reinforces the pathway as well.
Right. And when you're tired, you want that boost. Right. When you're stressed, you want to come down off of that. That makes sense. Alone, you feel like you've got somebody there with you, and bored for sure. All of a sudden, bam, now you're not bored. Right. Yeah. That makes sense. Jumping into pornography. So how does the science of addiction apply to pornography usage?
Yeah. So I really like this quote from a psychiatrist, Norman Diage. He says that pornography satisfies every one of the prerequisites for neuroplastic change. So when pornographers boast that they are pushing an envelope by introducing new, harder themes, what they don't say is that they must, because their customers are building up a tolerance to their content. So what he says is that all these things that we desire, pornography temporarily satisfies. We desire excitement. We desire being with somebody. We desire feeling good. And pornography checks those boxes, even if it is for a limited time and even if there are consequences. But also with that, you have a decreased tolerance over time and a need for an increase in the dopamine release and in the stimulation of your brain to kind of get that high again. A lot of people, when you talk about drug addiction, chasing that first time high, same thing's happening in the brain when you're watching porn.
Okay. So not only do they want to offer more, they have to offer more. Right. I could give you a very low level narcotic for, whatever, Norco for, it's a acetaminophen and it's got a little bit of narcotic in it. Right. But then eventually that would wear off. I would need to give you more to chase the first high, like you said. So they're finding that the same is true in pornography to get that same high?
Yeah, and that's something that we can go into details later, but basically you have a tolerance built up. Okay. I think of certain patients I saw last week who started off on a normal dose of opioids and then run out of it and not just want to increase the doses, but move to fentanyl on the streets and take a crazy amount that could kill them instantly.
And often does.
So yeah, it just kind of sets the stage for the dangers of porn and just how much it changes your brain and changes the function of the body.
Yeah. Let's walk down that path just a little bit. It's interesting to me that a lot of times you hear a story and you're like, oh my gosh, like how in the world? How could that? And I hate the judgment. How could they? I get it. You tell me any story, I'm like, yeah, I get how you could get there. Why? Because you need more and more and more and more and more of a drug, which actually takes you deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into this, what it basically is a bottomless pit of depravity to get the same high to satisfy the same joy, happiness, whatever the trigger is. It's not joy, but it's a high to chase the same thing, and you got to have more and more. And so you hear stories of how could a man, molest an 8-year-old girl? Like, I'm like, oh my God, it's that high, right? Man, that's crazy. That's crazy. And so pornographers offering literally a gateway drug into the entire sex trade is very, very feasible, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Crazy stuff. So that's why we're like, let's talk about this, right?
Yes.
So talk to me about the what the charge, the potency of dopamine can do.
Yeah. So I think it is good to talk about and it's good to know. A lot of times we think of substances such as cocaine or alcohol or nicotine, and where does porn fit into this? So if you look at this graph that we have pulled up, cocaine has the highest dopamine release, but just below that is porn. It's higher than sexual intercourse. It's higher than food. It's higher than nicotine. And not just that, but it lasts longer than all these substances, including cocaine. So we talk about the seriousness of it. People blow it off and say it's just something that is everywhere and it's on your phone. So how can it be dangerous? But I would argue that it's similar effects in the dopamine pathway, which is the reward system, and isn't necessarily something that you want to be having these huge spikes in, because it is reinforcing and does lead to addiction. It's up there with cocaine.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That is crazy. And those of you who are listening on one of the just the audio channels, this is going to be in the show notes. So pull this up. But the dopamine, is that a level percent of dopamine output?
Correct.
It's a level of dopamine that your brain releases. That's crazy that it's higher than, food. I understand. Food's good. Yeah, sex would be up there, higher than nicotine, right below cocaine. Like, holy cow. What does that tell you?
Yeah, it tells you that even though there are questions about whether porn is addictive, I think the graph clearly puts it up there with substances that are addictive.
Like with Coke.
Yeah.
Holy cow. Man, now you get it, right? Like why it has a hook in it. I talk about that all the time. Does this have a hook in it for you? Well, what do you mean? Is it hooking you? Man, up there with Coke. That is just amazing. Unbelievable. Why does this all matter in brain science?
Right. Yeah, great question. So some of the concerning things that we're going to talk about, and we kind of already touched on with the building up of the tolerance. So you're desensitized to things such as normal sex. So sex and the pleasure from sex with your wife, with whoever it may be, not as pleasurable because you're getting your fix from this unnatural level of dopamine that we weren't created to experience or view. And so you have that change in relations with other people and with sex.
So time out there. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying there is it impacts your real sex life because your fake sex life is giving you more dopamine than your real sex life does.
Correct.
Wow.
And if you think of it's always out there, you have options compared to one person, one wife, right? You could see why you have added layers of addiction possible because of not just a dopamine spike, but you can get that from other places.
Well, let's talk about
images. Yeah.
the trap for the single guy.
Right.
The single guy is like, oh, I'm just not married, so I'm just gonna just look at porn. I'm gonna my combination is gonna be porn and masturbation, and it's gonna be just there we go. Well, the reality is you are messing your brain up because you're feeding it higher levels of dopamine than what it's going to get in a real person sexual experience.
Yeah. And medical communities who are secular and don't take the biblical view into it
Sure.
even call this dopamine release unnatural. and
Wow.
dangerous and not something that people should be engaging with.
Wow. Well, I can see somebody make the argument, well, okay, that's fine. I'm going to get as much dopamine as I can get. So I'm just going to chase porn. You're going to have a very unhappy, real person sex life. And you're chasing artificial highs right up there with Coke. Those lead to very bad places, right? Because you need more and more and more of it if you're chasing that. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And also, it reminds me of patients who might start on opioids, and then they move and they increase it and get it from other places, and eventually are selling their bodies for fentanyl or for street drugs. And so the same thing can happen with porn use, where studies have shown you increase as the tolerance increases, and as you become desensitized, it changes to other avenues rather than normal porn use, into things that people categorize as violent or illegal.
Right.
So it is dangerous and very scary.
Yeah.
What it can do to your brain.
Yeah. And on our next episode, we've got Mark Brandy, who's a friend of mine that works with I Empathize, who's going to be here talking about porn and the sex trade, and as a gateway drug. And you're like, come on, man, come on, right? But no, for real, like that's how critical this issue is. Man, I didn't know any of this growing up. I knew none of this, none of it. So, yeah, that's awesome. What else about the science of the brain? Is there anything in particular that you're like, you know what? People need to know this. Men need to know this about what's going on in the brain.
Yeah. So along with our dopamine pathway leading to addiction, you also have the brain has a braking system. It's kind of what you call it, a braking system, where certain parts of the brain are telling the body, this isn't what we should do, what we should be doing. We need to stop. With continued porn use, it's shown that that braking system and the power it has actually decreases, and the systems and parts of your brain that are saying we need to watch this go into overdrive, and it leads to somebody feeling like they have no control over it. So when you talk about people with addiction, it's like, how could you watch porn at work? How could you use drugs from the streets or sell your body for drugs? Things like that don't really make sense to us. In the brain, that braking system is being blocked. And
so
you're just
I would call that your conscience. Is that braking system your conscience?
You could. It deals with willpower and impulse control and morality.
Okay.
So I think of it maybe as having a clear conscience, maybe being level-headed and being able to think about what am I doing right now, and porn can change that, and it can block that. So you're just hyper-focused on viewing porn and viewing these images.
Wow. This comes right out of Romans chapter 1 in the Bible. Paul talks about, who's the leader of the first century church, he was writing to the city of Rome. Okay, Rome was known for its culture and its absolute just debauchery of living. And Paul says, listen, God, after they said no to all this stuff, God gave them over to a depraved mind. Very interesting that I don't know what you would call that, but it's like you shrink that side of your mind so much, the other part takes over. God says, fine. Maybe he wired it that way.
Yeah, that's a good thought.
For men in general, I mean, this is your brain on drugs, right? Your brain on porn. My analogy here is to, like in the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, everybody smoked. It was like probably not the greatest thing. I can't imagine that, spiritual leaders of the time were like, smoking's great, and smoking, in church. I don't know if that happened. I wasn't around. But I do know my grandparents started smoking when they were probably 12, 13 years old, right? They smoked for a long time during the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. And all of a sudden, people found out that everybody was dying. And they found out that smoking caused cancer. Oh my gosh. In a lot of ways, it's like this issue is not just a novelty. Like this does jack up your brain. it jacks your brain up. It hooks you addictively in an addictive cycle, like we talked about in our last episode. But this has literal physiological, chemical realities that you are injecting into your life. You know, it is the smoking of our generation.
Yes, exactly. And I wouldn't be surprised if when I'm 50, that the same thing kind of comes out with porn as we learned about with smoking.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's amazing. But if you're a dad, you're a father figure in somebody's life, you're a single mom and you've got a son who you're like, oh my gosh, how do I help steer this guy? You know, what would you say to those who are working or around adolescents? Because one of the things I didn't tell you about Cody is Cody's involved in youth ministry at a church. I talked about this several episodes back. Giving back while in med school is a pretty cool thing, but you got a lot of involvement with adolescents as well. What would you say to dads who are dealing with adolescents in that area?
Yeah, I think you need to have a conversation, not just as a youth leader, but as a man. I'm sure every man watching this can relate. The world's going to tell you that it's good and it's natural. I think of my 8th grade health teacher who said that masturbation is natural. Usually you don't masturbate to nothing. Obviously, porn is involved. And I think of like certain coaches that would make jokes about it or parents on the team that would make jokes about it. So it's going to be talked about. So how do you want your son to take that, and what is that conversation going to look, what's that going to look like? And I think it has to happen now. We look at the average age of exposure to porn is 10 years old, which is crazy and only getting younger, and porn is becoming more widely available with technology. So I just think you can't shy away from it.
Right.
Is the first step.
Right.
Yeah.
And what do you tell the dad who's like, well, yeah, but that's a really hard conversation to have, you know? I want to let him find his own way.
I mean, he is going to find a way. And it's going to be through what his friends are looking at on the internet, what his health teacher is going to tell him, what happens in the locker room. So
right.
It's going to happen no matter what.
We're talking about in another series we did, protecting, providing, promoting, presiding. It is your responsibility, regardless of how freaking awkward it is, to jump in there. You wouldn't say, well, I just hope my kid figures out how to, walk across the street and safely, oh, sorry, just got hit by a car. That's on him. No, man. Come on, man. Mm-hmm. Like, step up. Move the right direction, step up as a man, and figure out how to protect and provide. These are your kids, dude. It's awkward. My dad didn't talk to me about this stuff. I'm sure your dad didn't either. Neither of us are here to throw dads under the bus. They did a wonderful job. But it is an area where we just can't remain silent, right? Because it'll find them, right? And they will find their way. And it's not going to be a good way.
Yeah. And I think of one of our students who was caught smoking weed. And his dad was like, well, I know what I was doing when I was his age. But I'm like, come on, dude. Like, sure, you might struggle with this today. You might have watched porn in the past, but it doesn't make you a hypocrite.
Right.
It makes you a loving father to warn your child about something that you struggle with and know the hardship and what it can cause.
Right.
So...
And the I didn't do it perfect is a great way to start. But that doesn't mean you've lost all moral authority. But let's face it, things are not what they used to be either. You can get something that's laced and your kid is dead. I mean, the stakes are way higher than what they used to be. I mean, fentanyl usage. My wife had a good friend of hers. Her daughter, 21 years old, at a New Year's Eve party just a couple years ago, took a pill out of the pill bowl, popped it, dead, gone. And we all know those stories. These stakes are higher. I mean, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when one of our friends' kids die.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And if it's not physical death, it's spiritual death and death of their future marriage and the way they view women. And
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we're getting into all those topics, and every one of them are huge important. The idea of this episode, number one, is to be aware, right? We talked about the idea I wanted to wrap this entire episode around was being aware of what is going on in the brain. And number two, taking responsibility for it. Not just acquiescing, well, this is just what happens, or, guys are going to be guys. Well, okay. We're going to get exposed to it. Yes, we're going to get exposed to it. But my goodness, taking responsibility for our lives in an immoral culture, in a culture that's going down. And all of a sudden, it seems like our cultural conscience kicks in every once in a while. It's like, oh my gosh, that happened. That's so bad. How did we get there? And I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. What happened to everything is relative? There is no truth. It's whatever pleases you. It's whatever makes you happy. And all of a sudden, we catch ourselves in some moral downspin, and like all of a sudden, something's bad. I mean, come on. The reality is that each of us are made in the image of God. We are moral creatures. We've got the opportunity to preserve our brains. We've got the opportunity to protect our own brains, our own souls in this. And not only that, but protect those around us and take responsibility for me in my house. Regardless of whatever's going on, taking responsibility for me in my house. So what is the plan of action? Number one is to have a piece of understanding, to know that we have got to understand this, and we have got to grapple with it, and we've got to jump into it, and not just leaving our kids to self-police, right? To be, what if a group of dads got together and said, you know what, no more, not for our kids. They're going to run into this here or there, but we're going to lock down. We're going to have our kids be the last one on the block to get cell phones. We're going to have them locked down so that they don't have access to the internet. Because the reality of letting a 10 or 12-year-old walking around with a little pornography store in their pocket is really just not smart, Number one, to have an understanding. Number two, taking responsibility. Number three, we've been talking about this for the last couple of episodes, and that is Sherpa freedom groups. And here's what they are. I'm going to unpack these a little bit and then give you a website where you can go check these out. So my experience is when I identify something in my life, I'm like, yep, I want to work on it. Well, I isolate, number one, which is not a good thing in this area. And then I work on it. And then I just try to create this culture of purity for myself. I eventually fail. I eventually think I stink even worse than I did before. I isolate more, and it creates a downward spiral. What if there were a different opportunity? What if in community with other men, in an online community, what if you had the opportunity to have the 360-degree approach that we've taken on this show, dealing with all the aspects of your life around this issue, your passion, your power, your purpose, and your perspective? What if we had a community where you had the very best resources available? Jay Stringer's book, Unwanted, that we talked about, we've have some of those resources. There's another book called The Death of Porn, where it is a wonderful book just about the nobility of the opportunity to be free from porn. The tool that I posted the last episode was a tool that walked through porn's addictive cycle and walked you through recognizing those triggers, recognizing some behavioral things. So not just a white-knuckle approach to get free from porn and the beatings will continue until morale improves type of an approach, but one that said, listen, you matter as a man. We're going to put you in a community of other men who are getting free together, who are looking at the best tools that are out there to be able to get free from porn. Wouldn't that be something you'd be interested in doing? I'll bet everybody listening to this is like, yeah, or I got a guy, I know a guy. So wouldn't that be great? Well, that is exactly what we're doing. I want to invite you to be part of Sherpa freedom groups. It's living life free from the addiction to pornography or another addictive cycle in your life. We can open it up pretty wide. But here's what I want you to do. I want you to email me the next stage at Sherpa5280.com. And if you're like, I'm not so sure about a group, I want to do one-on-one coaching around this, I will do that with you. But the page that we have set up on my website is this. It's Sherpa5280.com/Sherpa Freedom Groups. Sherpa is SHERPA. So Sherpa5280.com/Sherpa Freedom Groups, or email me the next stage at Sherpa5280.com. Men, there's incredible hope in a life that is lived free of this kind of stuff. Free of this kind of stuff. In fact, there's a promise. We call it the gold nugget around here. It's the one verse of Scripture that I want to hang every episode on, not just as a throwaway, but as a kind of an inductive approach to each one of these, at the end of the funnel of each one of these websites, to lay this on you and listen to this. It's a promise from God, who in the book of Isaiah, which is in the Old Testament, at one of the worst times in the nation of Israel's history, God says this: you, God, will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast because they trust in you. That is a promise that God will give you peace in your life where there used to be just craziness going on. He will give you peace whose minds are steadfast. And that doesn't mean perfect, but it does mean directionally focused. Man, I want to thank you so much for being part of this episode of the Next Stage podcast. It is thanks to our entire team at the Next Stage, and that includes Mike and Chris and Andy and Marcus. A lot of you just think, well, this is one guy. No way. This is 5 of us working together tirelessly to bring you the Next Stage. And I want to thank you for being part of this episode. I'm Rob Stout. I'm your host, and it is my honor to be part of doing this with you. I want to invite you to our next episode we have, and it's called Porn and the Sex Industry. And my guest will be Mark Brendy, who is works with a group called I Empathize, who work around training for first responders in the sex trade industry. First responders who go in and see some of the craziest things, and it's how to help them recognize and get people free from the sex trade industry. So I want to invite you into that and really taking a look at how pornography is a gateway drug to that. But it's been my privilege to be part of this. The Next Stage podcast, I invite you to click, to like, to forward, to, I don't even know what, click the bell icon. This is way too technologically mind-blowing for me, but do whatever you need to do. Click it, like it, forward it, go to one of our social media channels on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and forward this and help us spread the word about what we're doing here at the Next Stage. It's really valuable work, and I appreciate you being part of it. Until next time, go summit life's climb, be awesome in your world, and we will see you on our next episode of The Next Stage.